The dinner with the Baron is going well, until the dining hall door creaks open and the Baron stands up from his seat. His servants slowly begin to enter and creep up behind the seated guests, with sinister smiles that show off their sharp, pointed fangs. Before you can question what is happening, the Baron waves his hand and the servants begin to attack, grabbing the guests and biting down into their necks before draining them of their blood. You can only stare in horror as one by one they fall limply onto the table dead. Then the Baron turns towards you with a look of eager hunger on his face, as if he's staring at dessert. Welcome, or should I say welcome, back to From Mythos to Monsters, the podcast where I sink my teeth into fantasy's most popular monsters to see where they actually came from and see what lessons we can learn. If you couldn't guess by now, today we're going to be talking about one of the most legendary creatures in horror and fantasy, the vampire. This episode is in part to promote my new vampire class for D&D, and guys, I'm not kidding when I say this is genuinely the most exciting thing I've ever made. It features beautiful original artwork by Clown Wizard Art, which you might have already seen in the thumbnail, as well as all the abilities you'd expect and more for a playable vampire, including 3 different subclasses. If you want to pause the video to check it out, I've put a link in the description with more information. Now, climb aboard my carriage and let me take you on a perilous trip through the winding mountainous hills of history. Do not pet the wolves, they are not friendly. Vampires aren't monsters with clear origins, as creatures with vampire-like traits have been written about since ancient times in cultures all across the world. Even here in Scotland we have the myth of the Bavanshi, who lured men to their death before sucking their blood. By medieval times, stories about walking corpses that drank blood were common during epidemics and plagues. They might have just been talking about rare conditions like porphyria, a sensitivity to sunlight, tuberculosis or pellagra, which can cause paleness and gauntness, or rabies, which cause a person to bite others or become sensitive to flavours like garlic. While they probably just stemmed from a place of ignorance, these traits would continue to be attributed towards undead creatures like vampires forevermore. Yet the idea of the vampire as we know it today really didn't start to develop until the 18th century. The term was popularised after the beliefs of communities from southeastern Europe were for the first time recorded for people in the West to learn about. These included tales about the Albanian striga, the Greek Verkolakas, and the Romanian strigoi. You might notice none of these words really resemble the word vampire, which instead probably came from the German word vampir, which itself came from Slavic languages like Serbian. In Eastern Europe, belief in vampires might have been related to the fact that decomposition changed the appearance of a corpse after death. For example, rigor mortis could change its position, while the waning of hair and receding of gums could also give the appearance of activity. The corpse was therefore believed to still be alive in some way. Alternatively, it could have been because some people who were pronounced dead weren't actually dead, but rather just in a state of shock or maybe even so drunk that they had become comatose. When these people came to, while buried beneath 6 feet of dirt, they were understandably quite upset and would make so much of a fuss that it could even be heard above the ground. Well, as is the case with many mythical creatures, all of these myths began to get thrown together and mixed up like cake ingredients, and out of this metaphorical oven emerged something new: the vampire. The exact traits of a vampire varied region by region, but the idea that they drank blood, and therefore had fangs or sharp teeth to puncture skin with, was consistent between them all. In most legends they were also undead, pale, and unable to cast a reflection or a shadow. A person might become a vampire after being bitten by another vampire, although there were other methods as well. In some myths you could have become a vampire if you died of suicide or contagious disease, or if you had a spell cast on you. My personal favourite method, however, is to have a cat jump over your corpse. Why would feline acrobatics cause your body to turn undead and thirst for blood? I don't know, but I love it. Killing a vampire wasn't said to be easy. The most popular idea of how to slay them was to pierce their heart with a wooden stake, but other popular methods included using fire, sunlight, or decapitating them. They did have a number of weaknesses, however, such as fearing garlic or religious symbols, and being unable to cross running water or enter a residence without permission. In some legends, you could also escape a vampire by dropping a bunch of seeds on the ground, and it would be forced to sit there and count them all. I'm really sad that that specific trait doesn't appear more in modern media, because I find the image of an irritated vampire squatting down and trying to count a bunch of seeds as quickly as possible while their prey simply walks away to be pretty hilarious. However, when Westerners heard about these legends, they did more than just learn about vampires, they became terrified of them, leading to a period of intense vampire hysteria. This began in 1721, after there was said to be an outbreak of vampire attacks in eastern Prussia. This might seem ridiculous nowadays, but keep in mind that at this time, vampires being real hadn't yet been disproven in the public's popular imagination, so these attacks were actually taken very seriously and were meticulously documented by government officials. Fear of real-life vampires was so intense that people began accusing others of being vampires, and even staking corpses or burying people face down so that they couldn't rise from the dead. There were even reports of government officials going around and staking corpses themselves. Could you imagine your local politician doing that? Part of the reason vampire hysteria eventually dwindled was thanks to Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, after she sent her personal physician to investigate the claims. The physician concluded that vampires were not real, and the Empress henceforth passed laws that forbade people from opening graves or desecrating bodies. Once people couldn't do that anymore, they coincidentally began to calm down a bit and reports of vampire attacks stopped altogether. As a result, other countries in Europe began to introduce the same laws, and by the 20th century, vampires had become mythical creatures as we understand them today. Yet just because they now knew they weren't real, people's fascination with vampires was far from over with. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, many popular poems and novels about vampires were published, culminating in 1897 when the most famous work of vampire fiction ever written was published. I am of course talking about, say it with me, Dracula by Bram Stoker. Dracula has been incredibly influential in the modern perception and popularity of vampires. It is a story following a man who visits the elusive and feared Count Dracula at his castle in Transylvania, Romania, and ends up discovering he is actually undead. In the novel, Dracula's powers include the ability to shapeshift and control minds, traits which had little historical basis, but which became fundamental traits of the vampire from there on out. That's right, they weren't even associated with bats until Stoker said they were. Stoker also played with ideas of sexuality and gender norms that were shocking to Christian audiences at the time, but which have also endured as core ideas associated with the vampire. Unfortunately, that's probably what also led to the existence of teen fiction like Twilight. When writing the character of Dracula, while Stoker was no doubt inspired in part by the folk beliefs of rural Eastern European communities, such as the Romanian idea of the strigoi, mentioned earlier, the notion of a vampire being a member of the nobility was a new concept and likely had its own separate historical inspirations. Vlad Dracula III is the most commonly associated figure from history associated with Dracula, and not just because of his name. This 15th century Romanian prince was known for his brutality and even nicknamed the Impaler, drawing associations to vampires and the way that they had to be staked to be killed. Another lesser-mentioned ruler from neighbouring Hungary might have also inspired Stoker, the Countess Elizabeth Bathory, who believed blood was a secret to good health. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Elizabeth was said to have murdered dozens of young women and bathed in their blood, perhaps even drinking it as well. Bram Stoker's Dracula would continue to have mass appeal long after the author's death, over time inspiring many film remakes, including unlicensed ones like the legendary 1922 film Nosferatu, regarded to be one of the earliest and most influential horror films ever made. Nosferatu was also the first piece of media to highlight the idea of undead creatures being vulnerable to sunlight. I could talk forever about the things that vampires have inspired since then, from video game franchises like Castlevania to comic books like Blade to TV shows like Buffy. But I want to hone in on the impact they've had on fantasy, specifically in role-playing games. Two role-playing games in particular have had a huge hand in the continued popularity of vampires in fantasy. The first is Dungeons & Dragons, which included vampires as monsters as early as 1975, and the other is Vampire the Masquerade, first published in 1991. Vampire the Masquerade is a role-playing game set in a punk-gothic version of our world, and sees the player taking on the role of a vampire. Allowing gamers to step into the shoes of a vampire like this no doubt had a hand in modern ideas of vampires being potentially sympathetic characters or even protagonists, as opposed to something that was strictly evil. An exploration around this idea was only furthered by the fact that the game was released around the same time as the beloved movie Interview with a Vampire, which plays with similar ideas. Dungeons & Dragons, meanwhile, did the inverse, popularising the idea of the vampire as a terrifying antagonist. In its first edition, vampires are described as the most dreaded of chaotic evil undead, and oh boy, they weren't kidding. Back in the 70s, when a vampire hit you with even a single attack, it reduced your player's level by 2. Yeah, this motherfucker would pull up, slap you, and set you back weeks or even months of potential progress. But perhaps the most influential way that D&D cemented the vampire as being one of the biggest, baddest guys in all of fantasy was with the character Strahd von Zarovich. First appearing in the Ravenloft Adventure module for Advanced D&D, Strahd quickly became one of the most beloved original characters D&D has ever created. No doubt inspired by Dracula himself, he was Lord of Ravenloft and one of the most politically and physically powerful creatures in the world. While he was intelligent and ruthless, he was also romantic and tragic, and he would go on to keep appearing in future editions of the game until his fame really skyrocketed in 2016 with the 5th edition module Curse of Strahd. Perhaps the reason that this adventure saw Strahd become so popular was because its writer, Chris Perkins, understood the character so well. I'd like to read out this quote that Chris Perkins gave while describing his process designing Curse of Strahd. In Gothic horror fiction, the villain's torment is often self-inflicted. The villain becomes, ironically, a victim of their own monstrous nature and horrible acts. He, that being Strahd, is a malignant narcissist trapped by his malignant narcissism. Forever alone, forever feared and unable to change. He must be destroyed because salvation is beyond him. In horror fiction, the villain is framed as inhumanity personified, often serving as a cautionary tale. Once you lose your humanity, you can never get it back. Other fantasy villains aren't usually burdened with that kind of terrifying reality. Perkins' quote is a nice way to round out our deep dive into the vampire, as it's as true of Dracula as it was of Strahd, despite the fact that their two writers existed 200 years apart. Now, all of this research got me thinking about what I think makes a vampire character compelling. In 2024, I watched the remake of Nosferatu in the cinema, which has become one of my favourite horror films ever. It made me realise that vampires don't need all the bells and whistles they've been assigned over centuries of depictions. Most of these, like the idea that they can't eat garlic or cross running water, don't even really have a strict historical basis that needs to be respected anyway. I think more writers need to take a less is more approach to vampires. Be loose with what they can do instead of assigning them these strict roles, or even just have them be monsters that gorge on blood and live in darkness, but play within those ideas. I promise that they alone can be enough to create a character that is equal parts tragic, dangerous, and terrifying. Alright, the sun will soon rise, so let's let the vampire return to its crypt. I hope you enjoyed this lengthy deep dive into this juggernaut of horror that is so widely beloved, and if you're interested in the playable D&D version that I've created, check it out in the link below. Remember that if you subscribe to my Patreon, even just for a month, you will get access to that and everything else I've ever made. Okay, take care.